My name isn't important yet. What matters is that I'm 32 years old. And 3 days ago, I received a message that quietly dismantled everything I believed about loyalty, family, and love. It didn't arrive as a long explanation or a dramatic confession, just a single line. Guess who has something interesting for you? Attached beneath it was an audio file. 4 minutes, 23 seconds. I didn't know it then, but that was all the time it took to erase a lifetime of assumptions. I was still at work when my phone buzzed. Late evening, fluorescent lights humming, spreadsheets open on my screen. The kind of moment that feels completely ordinary until it isn't. Outside the windows, the city glowed the way it always did, confident and indifferent. Inside, I was tired, successful on paper, and quietly stretched thin. I'd built a life that looked impressive from the outside, a stable career, a solid income, the kind of job relatives brag about. But every month, without fail, a large portion of that income disappeared into accounts that weren't mine. I told myself that was what responsibility looked like. It had started years earlier with something small, a phone call, a problem, a request that felt reasonable. I said yes without thinking, relieved that I finally could help. One transfer turned into another, then another. Over time, it became routine, automatic, expected. I never questioned it because good daughters don't keep score. By the time I noticed how little was left for myself, how often I declined dinners with friends, how impossible saving felt, I was already too deep to ask uncomfortable questions. So I didn't. I adjusted. I shrank my needs. I convinced myself that sacrifice was love. That night, when I saw who had sent the message, I smiled. It was my younger sibling, the one everyone called carefree, the one I defended in conversations, the one I had supported through college, transitions, and figuring things out. I assumed the message was harmless, a joke, maybe gossip. I pressed play. Before I continue, let me pause for a moment. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever been the reliable one, the helper, the person who always handles it, take a second to show support in whatever way feels right to you. And if you're watching from somewhere specific right now, share where you are and what time it is. I like knowing who's here with me as this unfolds. I didn't finish listening right away. At first, I just sat there, staring at my screen, waiting for context to arrive, waiting for something that would make the voices sound less casual, less amused, because that's what shocked me most. There was no anger in the recording, no argument, no tension, just laughter. People speaking freely, comfortably, as if they were certain the words would never reach me, as if I were an idea, not a person. As if everything I had given was simply part of the background, useful, invisible, replaceable. I stopped the audio before it ended, not because it was over, but because I wasn't ready to hear the rest. At that moment, I was still clinging to the possibility that I'd misunderstood, that there was context missing, that love, even flawed love, was still real. I hadn't done the math. I hadn't opened my banking history. I hadn't realized how carefully my role had been written for me. All I knew was this: something fundamental had shifted, and once that happens, there's no going back to who you were before. In the next part, I'll take you back to how this all started, long before that message, before the recording, before I understood the difference between being needed and being valued. Because the truth is, this didn't begin with 4 minutes and 23 seconds of audio. It began the first time I said yes when I should have asked why. Before that audio file existed, before suspicion or anger had a name, my life followed a familiar rhythm. Work hard, stay reliable, don't complain. On paper, I was doing well, the kind of well that looks impressive in family conversations. A stable career, a respectable salary, steady progress. I lived alone in a small apartment that I told myself was temporary, even though I'd renewed the lease more times than I could remember. I worked long hours, ate quick meals, and told myself there would be time for everything else later. Later never came, because every month something else came first. It didn't start as control, that's important. It started as urgency. A call late one afternoon, stress in my parents' voice, something had gone wrong, unexpected bills, a shortfall, a problem that needed fixing now. The amount wasn't huge. I remember feeling proud when I sent the money. Useful, adult, trusted. That feeling is addictive. The next request came more easily, then another, each one framed as temporary, each one followed by reassurance, just until things stabilize, just until we're back on our feet. But stability, I learned, is a moving target when someone else is spending your sense of responsibility. Soon, the requests stopped sounding like emergencies and started sounding like routine. Monthly amounts, specific dates, expectations. No discussion, just updates. When I hesitated once, just once, I was reminded how much they depended on me, how much pressure they were under, how lucky I was to be in a position to help. So I swallowed the hesitation. I told myself that this was what families did, that success meant pulling others along with you, that love didn't need receipts. I became very good at not asking questions. When my younger sibling needed support, it was assumed I'd help. When plans were made, they were made with my resources already counted. I wasn't consulted, I was informed. And every time I noticed, every time a small knot of discomfort formed in my chest, I dismissed it as selfishness. That's what people like me do. We confuse guilt with generosity. We confuse silence with peace. Over time, my roles solidified. I was the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who didn't make a fuss. Family jokes formed around it, compliments that didn't feel like compliments at all. "You're so good with money. You don't really need much, do you? You're strong, you can handle it." I believed them. I believed them when I said no to things I wanted, when I postponed milestones, when I convinced myself that fulfillment would come later once everyone else was settled. What I didn't realize was that later wasn't part of the plan, because when support becomes expected, gratitude quietly disappears, and when gratitude disappears, empathy follows. By the time I sensed something was off, it wasn't dramatic. No fights, no obvious cruelty, just a subtle imbalance that kept growing unnoticed because I was the one absorbing it. That night, the night of the message, I still believed that everything I'd given meant something, that even if I was tired, even if I felt invisible sometimes, the foundation was real. I hadn't yet understood that the story I was telling myself wasn't the same one being told about me, and I definitely didn't know that while I was budgeting my own life down to the essentials, someone else was treating my limits as optional. In the next part, I'll tell you about the detail I discovered after listening to that recording, a single fact that forced me to stop rationalizing, stop defending, and finally look at the situation without excuses. Because once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and it changed everything.
I didn't listen to the audio again that night. Not at first. Instead, I did what I always did when something felt uncomfortable. I looked for logic, for an explanation that would let me keep the peace inside my own head. I told myself maybe the recording was a joke taken out of context. Maybe I'd misunderstood the tone. Maybe people sounded cruel when they didn't know they were being recorded. Excuses are easy when you've practiced them for years. What wasn't easy was sleeping. So sometime after midnight, sitting on the edge of my bed in my dim apartment, I opened my banking app. Not with a plan, just with a restless need to see something concrete. Numbers felt safer than emotions. At first it was just scrolling. Then it became counting. Transfers, recurring payments, one-time emergencies, tuition payments, living expenses, repairs, gifts disguised as necessities, month after month after month. I opened a spreadsheet. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. When something feels out of control, I put it in columns.
By the time the sun started hinting at morning, I had a total. The number stared back at me, calm and undeniable. It wasn't symbolic, it wasn't abstract, it was exact. That was the moment the story I'd told myself collapsed. Because love doesn't need accounting, but exploitation always leaves a paper trail. Still, even then, I tried to soften it. I told myself the money didn't matter as much as the intention, that families don't operate like businesses, that if I brought this up, I'd look petty, cold, ungrateful. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a charge that didn't fit. It was recent, large, definitely not routine. A travel company, an amount that made my stomach tighten before my brain could catch up. I stared at the screen, waiting for recognition to arrive. It didn't. I hadn't booked a trip, I hadn't discussed one. I hadn't even taken a vacation in years. When I traced the chargeback, the timeline lined up with something else, something I'd ignored earlier because it felt awkward to question. Suddenly, the recording didn't sound abstract anymore. It sounded logistical. The laughter, the certainty, the casual way they spoke, like people who were very sure of their leverage. And then something else surfaced, an uncomfortable realization that had nothing to do with money. I wasn't being asked anymore. Decisions were being made for me. My role had shifted so gradually that I hadn't noticed when consent stopped being part of the equation. Somewhere along the way, my support had become assumed, budgeted, relied upon. I wasn't a helper, I was a resource. That realization hurt more than the total ever could, because money can be replaced, time can't, and the years I'd spent believing I was building closeness were years someone else had spent building entitlement. When my phone lit up again later that night, I didn't answer. I watched the screen fade to black and felt something unfamiliar settle in. Clarity. Not anger, not revenge, just a sharp, quiet understanding that whatever happened next, I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't see what I saw. The audio file wasn't the betrayal, it was the confirmation. In the next part, I'll tell you what I did with that confirmation, who I turned to, what they told me, and why that conversation forced me to make the first real decision of my adult life. Because once you see the truth clearly, staying silent becomes a choice, and I was running out of excuses. By morning, I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired in the usual way. My body felt heavy, yet my mind was strangely alert, like it had finally stopped arguing with itself. I knew I couldn't carry what I'd discovered alone. There are moments when silence feels protective, but this wasn't one of them. This was the kind of truth that needed air, or it would rot inside me. So, just after sunrise, I reached out to the one person who had always known me before I became the reliable one. She answered faster than I expected. We met somewhere neutral, public, quiet enough to talk without being overheard. I brought my laptop, she brought a notebook. That alone should tell you how serious it was. I didn't start with emotions. I never do. I played the audio. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When it ended, she didn't rush to comfort me or soften what we'd heard. She asked questions instead, precise ones, about dates, about money, about consent. Then she looked at me and said the words I hadn't allowed myself to think. This isn't normal family conflict. She explained it calmly, the way professionals explain things that are emotionally charged but legally clear. What I was describing wasn't generosity gone wrong or miscommunication. It was a pattern, a long-standing one, dependence built on expectation, control disguised as closeness. I waited for her to say something that would let me minimize it. She didn't. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever actually agree to the most recent charge?" When I said no, she nodded like she'd expected that answer. "That changes things," she said, "because now it's not just emotional." That's when the fear arrived. Not panic, something colder, more focused. The fear that comes when you realize this isn't going to resolve itself quietly, that setting boundaries wouldn't just upset people, it would disrupt a system that relied on my silence. She walked me through my options, practical steps, immediate ones, things I could control, things I couldn't. There was no talk of confrontation yet, no dramatic gestures, just containment. Protect yourself first. That advice felt foreign, almost wrong. I'd spent years being told that protecting myself was selfish, that endearance was proof of love. Hearing someone say the opposite felt like learning a new language as an adult. Before we left, she asked me one final question. What do you want to happen? I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer wasn't revenge, it wasn't apology, it wasn't repayment. I wanted the truth to stop being mine alone. I wanted to step out of the role I'd been assigned without consent. And most of all, I wanted the constant calculation, the emotional budgeting to end. That afternoon, I made my first move. A small one, but deliberate. Then another. Each action felt like removing a thread from a tightly woven fabric. I knew if I kept going, the whole structure would loosen. My phone stayed silent for a while, then it didn't. Messages came in with confusion first, then concern, then something sharper underneath, panic dressed up as affection. I didn't respond. For the first time in years, I let the discomfort sit on the other side of the line. What surprised me most wasn't how hard it felt. It was how quickly the guilt faded when I stopped feeding it. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized something unsettling and freeing at the same time. Once you stop playing your part, everyone else has to improvise, and not everyone is good at that. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened when they noticed the change, how quickly concern turned into pressure, and why one phone call made it clear there would be no quiet resolution. Because when a system is built on your compliance, your refusal feels like betrayal.
The silence didn't last long. At first, the messages were light, almost polite, short check-ins framed as worry. Are you okay? You seemed off yesterday. Just making sure everything's fine. I didn't reply. That's when the tone shifted. Concern has a shelf life. Once it expires, it curdles into something else, something sharper, more urgent, less patient. The first call I answered came late in the evening. I recognized the voice immediately, the softness carefully applied, like makeup before a public appearance. "You've been hard to reach," they said, as if I'd done something wrong by being unavailable to explain myself. I kept my answers neutral, vague. I said I was busy, that I needed time, that I was sorting through things. None of those responses were acceptable, because what they really wanted wasn't information, it was reassurance, confirmation that I was still in my place, that whatever adjustment I was making wouldn't affect them. When reassurance didn't come, pressure followed. Subtle at first, reminders of everything they'd done for me growing up, references to sacrifice, to obligation, to how much stress this was causing. Then came the pivot. If something's wrong financially, you should have said something sooner. That stopped me. I realized then how quickly the story was being rewritten, not curiosity about why I'd pulled back, just an assumption that I was failing, that something must be wrong with me. It was almost impressive how efficiently responsibility was redirected. By the next day, the calls were more frequent, the language less careful. Words like dramatic, confused, overreacting appeared, each one placed precisely where empathy should have been. And then came the reminder I hadn't expected, but somehow always feared. You don't want this to affect how people see you. It wasn't a threat yet, just a suggestion, a warning wrapped in concern, the implication that reputations were fragile things and that mine could be managed for me if necessary. That's when something inside me hardened.
not into anger, into resolve. I recognized the pattern now, the same one I'd watched play out for years, just never pointed at me directly. Compliance was rewarded with warmth. Resistance was treated as instability. This wasn't about misunderstanding, it was about control. That evening, I stopped engaging entirely. I let the calls ring out, I muted conversations. I created space, not as punishment, but as protection. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I felt steady. Not calm exactly, but anchored, like I'd finally found the ground beneath my feet after years of standing on shifting expectations. Of course, the escalation was inevitable. When persuasion fails, people who are used to being obeyed reach for leverage. It arrived in a single conversation the following morning, one that stripped away all remaining pretense. No softness, no concern, just a demand delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they still held all the power. They told me what I would do next, where I would be, what I would say, and what would happen if I didn't comply. As they spoke, I realized something that would have terrified me just days earlier. They assumed I was still afraid. They didn't know that fear had already burned out, replaced by clarity. Because once you see manipulation for what it is, it loses its mystique. It becomes clumsy, predictable, desperate. In the next part, I'll tell you about that conversation, what was said, what was threatened, and the moment I decided I wasn't negotiating anymore, because that was the instant I stopped reacting and started acting.
The call came early, earlier than anyone who respected boundaries would dare. I answered it not because I wanted to, but because something in me needed to hear how far this would go. There was no greeting, no warmth, just instruction. I was told where I needed to be in a few days, what my role would be, what version of myself I was expected to perform. It was delivered calmly, confidently, like a schedule being finalized, not a request, not a discussion. I listened without interrupting. Then came the conditions. If I cooperated, everything could go back to normal. The tension would dissolve, the family would move on, people wouldn't talk, reputations would remain intact. If I didn't, that's when the voice changed. Not raised, not emotional, just precise, strategic, the kind of tone people use when they believe they're being generous by explaining consequences in advance. They mentioned my workplace, my position, how easy it would be to express concern to the right people, how believable it would sound coming from family, how instability could be framed as worry, how doubt could be planted without making accusations. I felt my pulse slow. Not because I was calm, but because I finally understood the stakes. This wasn't about fixing a misunderstanding. This was about enforcing obedience. For years, I'd assumed the dynamic existed because I allowed it. I was wrong. It existed because it was maintained, carefully, deliberately, with rewards and punishments like any other system of control. As the threat hung in the air, I realized something else. They hadn't expected me to push back. They were speaking from memory, from years of success using the same tactics, the same emotional levers, the same assumptions about my fear. That was their mistake. I asked a single question. Are you saying this on record? The pause was immediate, unscripted, heavy. What do you mean? I explained calmly that I was documenting the conversation, that I'd learned recently how important accuracy was, that I preferred clarity. Silence. In that silence, the power shifted, not dramatically, quietly. They recovered quickly, of course, attempted to laugh it off, to retreat into vagueness, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped just long enough for me to see what was underneath. Control doesn't like witnesses. The call ended abruptly. I sat there afterward, phone still warm in my hand, realizing how close I'd come,
how many times I'd come to folding just to avoid conflict, to preserve the illusion of harmony, and how costly that illusion had been. That afternoon, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I prepared. I gathered documents. I organized timelines. I made copies. I didn't do it with rage or theatrics, just with methodical care, the kind that comes from knowing you might need proof not to convince others, but to protect yourself. By evening, messages were flooding in again. Confusion had turned into urgency, urgency into accusation. I didn't reply, because something inside me had settled. They could escalate, they could spin stories, they could attempt damage control, but they could no longer pretend I was unaware, and that knowledge alone changed the balance. In the next part, I'll tell you about the decision I made next, one that ensured there would be no quiet reversal, no private pressure campaign, no opportunity to rewrite events behind closed doors. Because once someone shows you they're willing to threaten your livelihood to maintain control, you don't negotiate.
You make it impossible for them to do it again. Once the threat was spoken out loud, even briefly, there was no going back to ambiguity. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel empowered in some cinematic way. What I felt was focused, the kind of focus that comes when you finally understand the rules of a game you didn't realize you were playing. If they were willing to apply pressure privately, then anything I did next had to remove that option entirely. That meant no side conversations, no private explanations, no chances to twist the narrative before I spoke. It meant witnesses. The decision formed quietly, without fanfare. I would show up where I was expected to show up, but not in the way they imagined. I printed everything. Bank records condensed into clean summaries, dates, amounts, patterns that spoke for themselves. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to, but numbers told the story more clearly than emotion ever could. I also transcribed the audio, word for word, time-stamped, neutral formatting, no emphasis, no drama, just language, preserved exactly as it had been spoken. Seeing it on paper hit differently. Laughter looks cruel when it's written down. I organized it all into a single folder, bright, impossible to ignore, something tangible I could hold on to when doubt crept in. Then I did something else, something that felt small but mattered more than I realized at the time. I asked someone to come with me, not for backup, not for confrontation, just presence, a neutral observer, someone without history or loyalty to the situation, someone who could see things clearly if I couldn't. When I explained why, they didn't question me, they didn't tell me to reconsider, they didn't suggest forgiveness or patience. They just said, "I'll be there." That was when the weight shifted, because isolation is one of the most powerful tools control relies on, the belief that whatever happens will be your word against theirs, that no one else will see what's really going on. I refused that setup. The night before, messages intensified, not from one place, from everywhere. Extended family, indirect questions, carefully worded concern, people checking in without actually asking anything. It was obvious a story was already circulating. I didn't correct it. There's a strange power in letting people sit with incomplete information. It exposes how quickly assumptions form and who is willing to ask questions before choosing sides. I slept surprisingly well. The next day, I dressed simply, nothing symbolic, nothing defiant, just myself, calm on the surface, steady underneath. As we drove, I went over the plan once more, not to rehearse lines, but to remind myself of intention. I wasn't there to punish. I wasn't there to humiliate. I wasn't there to win. I was there to end something, to end the silence, to end the distortion, to end the version of me that existed only to keep others comfortable. As we arrived, the scene looked exactly as it always had, carefully arranged, polished, familiar faces moving through familiar motions, everything in its place, except me.
I could feel it before anyone said a word, the tension beneath the surface, the unspoken awareness that something was different, that the dynamic had shifted, even if they didn't yet know how. And then my name was called, invited forward, expected to perform. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened when I stepped into that moment, what I said, what I didn't say, and how quickly control crumbled when the truth stopped being private. Because once the lights are on and everyone is watching, silence is no longer an option.
When my name was called, the room responded the way rooms always do when they expect something familiar. Polite attention, relaxed smiles, the quiet confidence that nothing unexpected is about to happen. They thought they knew why I was there. I walked forward slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel each step. I wanted to remember this moment clearly, without adrenaline blurring it into something dramatic or unreal. The space was warm, bright, carefully arranged. People who had known me my entire life sat waiting, ready to applaud the version of me they'd been told to expect. I didn't look at anyone at first. I placed the folder down, I steadied my breath, and then I spoke. I started where everyone was comfortable: gratitude, shared history, familiar language. I saw shoulders relax. I saw approval settle back into place. This was the role they recognized. Then I shifted, not abruptly, just enough to make the room tilt. I talked about responsibility, about support, about how easily care becomes expectation when one person always says yes. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice, I let the room lean in on its own. People listen more closely when they're unsure where you're going. Then I introduced numbers. Not emotionally, not angrily, just factually. Amounts, durations, patterns. I watched expressions change in real time, confusion first, then surprise, then something quieter and heavier. People doing mental math, reevaluating stories they'd accepted without question. I didn't look toward the head table. I didn't need to. The air shifted. Someone tried to interrupt. I didn't acknowledge it. I wasn't there to debate, I was there to finish. When I mentioned the most recent charge, the one made without my knowledge, the murmurs grew louder. Discomfort spread like ripples in water. And then I did the thing they never expected. I pressed play. The sound filled the room immediately. Too clear, too unmistakable. Familiar voices stripped of performance, speaking freely in a space they believed was safe. Laughter landed first, then the words. The room went still in a way I'd never experienced before. Not polite silence, but shock, the kind that steals oxygen. Someone whispered my name. Someone else stood up. The audio played long enough to remove doubt. Then I stopped it. I didn't let it run until someone begged. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't need repetition. I spoke once more, calmly, clearly. I'm not here to ask for anything back. I'm not here to threaten or punish. I'm here because I won't carry this privately anymore. That was all. I stepped back. If you're still with me right now, pause for a second and ask yourself, what would you do in that moment? Would you protect the peace, or would you protect yourself? Let me know in the comments. And if this story feels uncomfortably familiar, take a moment to show support in whatever way helps stories like this reach the people who need them. Behind me, chaos began. Voices overlapping, denials, accusations. Someone crying, someone else demanding explanations. I didn't engage. I picked up the folder, turned, and walked away. The moment I crossed the threshold into the open air, something inside me released. Not triumph, not relief, completion, because the truth had finally left my body and entered the world. And once it's out there, it can't be controlled. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened immediately after, who chased explanations, who disappeared into silence, and how quickly roles reversed once accountability entered the room. Because exposure doesn't end a story, it reveals everyone's part in it. The moment I stepped outside, the noise behind me blurred into something distant and indistinct. Doors closed, voices rose. The world I'd just left began rearranging itself without my participation. I didn't rush away. I stood still for a moment, breathing in air that felt colder and cleaner than it had minutes earlier. My hands were steady. My chest felt lighter, not because nothing hurt anymore, but because I wasn't holding everything alone. Behind me, someone called my name. I didn't turn. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. I already knew what would be said. Explanations, minimizations, attempts to reframe what had just happened into something manageable, something quieter, something that could still be controlled. That door was closed. By the time I reached the car, messages were already arriving. Missed calls, notifications stacking faster than I could read them. The urgency had shifted. Panic had replaced confidence. People who had never questioned the arrangement were suddenly desperate to understand it. Inside, the room I'd left behind fractured. Some people defended what they'd always believed. Others asked questions they should have asked years earlier. A few stayed silent, processing the discomfort of realizing they'd been part of something without knowing it. Roles collapsed quickly when the script disappeared. The first apology arrived before I got home. Careful, measured, focused less on harm done and more on how embarrassing everything had become. It was followed by anger, sharp, defensive, accusing me of overreacting, of airing private matters publicly. The contradiction was almost surreal. I didn't reply. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd already said it. Later that night, one message stood out. Short, unexpected, from someone who had never intervened before. "I didn't know," it read. "I should have asked more questions." That mattered more than all the explanations combined, because accountability doesn't always come with loud apologies. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of someone finally seeing what you were never allowed to say. Over the next few days, the ripple effects spread. Conversations I wasn't part of, reputations re-examined, stories adjusted, people choosing sides without realizing they were doing it. I learned something important during that time. Truth doesn't demand agreement, it just demands acknowledgement. Some relationships tightened, others dissolved, a few transformed into something honest for the first time, and some vanished entirely, unable to survive without the version of me that kept everything comfortable. That hurt, but it also confirmed what I'd already begun to accept. Anything that depends on your silence isn't sustainable. One evening, I listened to the recording again, not out of obsession, but closure. The voices sounded smaller now, less powerful, stripped of the authority I'd once given them. They were just people, flawed, afraid, defensive, and I was no longer orbiting around them. I slept deeply that night. The next morning, I woke up to a different kind of quiet, not absence, but space, the kind that allows new things to grow if you let it. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, how distance changed perspective, how unexpected alliances formed, and why healing didn't look like forgiveness or reconciliation. It looked like something much simpler: peace.
The weeks that followed didn't unfold dramatically. There were no public apologies, no sudden transformations, no cinematic redemption arcs. Just distance. At first, that distance felt unfamiliar, almost wrong. I kept waiting for the pull of obligation to return, for the reflex to explain myself, to fix things, to make sure everyone was okay. It never did. Instead, something else took its place: perspective. With space came clarity. Patterns I'd spent years normalizing suddenly looked obvious, not cruel in a theatrical way, but methodical, repeated, designed to keep me small, useful, and quiet. I realized how much energy I'd spent managing other people's emotions, anticipating reactions, adjusting myself to avoid discomfort. The absence of that labor was startling. My days became simpler. Not easier, simpler. I redirected what I'd been giving away for years: time, attention, resources. I invested them where they actually returned something: stability, rest, self-respect. Some people drifted back cautiously, testing whether the old dynamics still worked. I stayed polite, firm, unavailable to negotiations disguised as concern. Others disappeared entirely. I let them. Healing didn't arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as neutrality, the ability to think about the past without feeling pulled back into it. One conversation stood out among the rest: brief, unadorned, honest. "I should have protected you," someone said. "I didn't know how." It wasn't closure, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's enough. I stopped waiting for apologies I knew would never come. I stopped hoping for accountability from people who built their identities on avoiding it. And in doing so, I gave myself something I'd never had before: permission. Permission to build a future that wasn't shaped by repayment. Permission to want things without justifying them. Permission to choose peace without explaining why. I didn't lose a family. I outgrew a system that depended on my silence. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to leave you with one thought: boundaries don't destroy relationships, they reveal them. Whatever survived was real. Whatever doesn't was never meant to be carried by you alone. If this story connected with you, share your experience in the comments. Someone reading might need to know they're not imagining things. And if you want to hear more stories like this, quiet, real, and unfiltered, you already know where to find them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for choosing yourself.